One important theorem sa paghahanap ng local minimum or local maximum ng isang function is the Fermat's theorem. And it states that if the function f has a local minimum or maximum at a number x sub 0 and f prime of x exists, then f prime of x sub 0 is equal to 0. So anong ibig sabihin nito? Kapag yung f natin ay merong local minimum or maximum at x sub 0, then yung x sub 0 na yon is a critical number. Pero hindi lahat ng critical number will produce a local minimum or maximum. Let's consider this graph. Ito yung given doon sa previous na lesson natin. Nakalink doon sa baba kung gusto ninyong makita. Meron tayong local extrema at E, at F, at G, and at H. So let's examine yung local maximum dito sa ating E. Observe that the function to the left of this point is increasing. At yun namang to the right niya, decreasing. Okay? So there is a change from increasing to decreasing. And true din ito kay G. Okay? There is a change from increasing to decreasing. Check naman natin ngayon yung F. To the left niya is decreasing, to the right niya is increasing. So there is a change from decreasing to increasing. Ganon din sa H, decreasing to increasing. Thus, we find that f has a local extremum at x sub 0 if f prime changes signs at x sub 0. And this brings us to a very important result known as the first derivative test. So the first derivative test states that given a critical number x sub 0 of a continuous function f, then we have the following cases. First, if f prime changes signs from positive to negative at x sub 0, then f has a local maximum at x sub 0. If f prime changes signs from negative to positive at x sub 0, then f has a local minimum at x sub 0. And if f prime does not change signs at x sub 0, then there is no local extremum at x sub 0. Which is obvious naman, di ba? Pag nag-change yung f prime natin from positive to negative, ibig sabihin, meron tayong local maximum doon sa critical number na yon. At kapag nag-change from negative to positive, meron tayong local minimum. Pero pag walang change, let's say positive-positive or negative-negative, syempre wala tayong makukuhang extremum. So let's have this example. Given f of x equals 3/5 x raised to 5 plus 3/2 x raised to 4 minus x cubed minus 3x squared, let's determine the relative extrema values of the function. So nagawa na natin ito kanina doon sa link na nasa baba. So for our solution, we find f prime of x and we know that we have 3x raised to 4 plus 6x cubed minus 3x squared minus 6x. For step 2, we will find the critical numbers. That is, gagawin natin tong equal to 0. Okay? And then, kukunin natin yung mga numbers. So this is 0, this is 1, negative 1, negative 2. Therefore, our critical numbers are negative 2, negative 1, 0, and 1. Next thing is, we create a table of signs. Kasi dito yung importante, di ba? Dito natin malalaman kung merong relative extrema yung function natin. So, this is the table of signs at makikita natin dito that mag-change siya from positive to negative dito, from negative to positive dito, from positive to negative dito, at negative to positive dito. So what does that mean? At x equals negative 2, meron tayong relative maximum by the first derivative test. At x equals negative 1, meron tayong relative minimum. At x equals 0, meron tayong relative maximum. And at x equals 1, meron tayong relative minimum. And finally, since ang hinahanap natin is yung relative extrema values, kukunin lang natin yung values niya. For our relative max, ito yung mga relative max natin, negative 2 and 0. So, ilalagay lang natin ito sa ating f of x. That is, f of negative 2 is equal to 4/5 and f of 0 is equal to 0. So, yan yung dalawa nating relative maximum. For our relative minimum, eto naman, negative 1 tsaka 1. At ipa-plug in din natin ito doon sa ating function. So, we have f of negative 1 is negative 1. F of negative 1 is equal to negative 11 over 10. And f of 1 is equal to negative 19 over 10. So, it means that f of x has a relative maximum of 4/5 at x equals negative 2 and 0 at x equals 0. And it also has a relative minimum of negative 11 over 10 at x equals negative 1 and negative 19 over 10 at x equals 1. For our second example, given f of x equals sine x, where x is from 0 to 2 pi, let's determine the relative extrema values of the function. For our solution, ganun ulit, step 1, we find f prime of x. Ano bang f prime of x? Diba that is sine x, the derivative of that is cosine x. Note that this is from 0 to 2 pi. For step 2, we find the critical numbers. So, ano yung mga values na magzi-zero si cosine x natin? Okay? Therefore, meron tayong dalawa. That is, pi over 2 at 3 pi over 2. So, kung hindi kayo sure dito, pwede nyo siyang i-graph para makita ninyo or gamitin nyo yung left-hand method. Now, for number 3, let's create a table of signs. So, meron tayong pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2 here. Pwede tayong gumamit dito ng pi over 4. Dito naman is pi. Okay? And dito naman is 2 pi. Okay? Pwede yan. Kasi nga, 0 to 2 pi naman yung ating value for x. Okay? At kapag plinag-in natin ito, doon sa ating f of x, okay? Ang ating f of x, by the way, is cosine x. Makikita ninyo na ang sign niya is positive. Ito naman, pag plinag-in natin dito, this is negative. At ito naman, pag plinag-in natin dito is positive. Therefore, what does that mean? At x over 2 na critical value, meron tayong relative maximum kasi nag-change siya from positive to negative. And at the critical value 3 pi over 2, nag-change from negative to positive, so meron tayong relative minimum. So finally, pwede na natin kunin yung values ng mga relative extrema. For the relative maximum, f of pi over 2 is equal to okay? So, yung pi over 2 na ito, pinasok lang natin doon sa ating sine x. And then, the relative minimum naman is f of 3 pi over 2. So, ito naman, plinag-in din natin doon sa ating sine x. And that is equal to negative. And for the final example, given the table of signs below, determine the type of relative extrema that occur at the critical numbers. So, tignan lang natin. From positive to negative, nag-change to sa critical number na 1. From negative to negative, no change sa critical number na 2. And from negative to positive, nag-change sa critical number na 3. Therefore, we can conclude that f has a relative maximum at x equals 1. Okay? Nag-change kasi from positive to negative. F has no extrema at x equals 2 kasi no change. And finally, F has a relative minimum at x equals 3 kasi nag-change from negative to positive.